What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I wanted to pose the question, are hand traps a good and healthy form of interaction in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh? Because if this past Spiral format has taught us anything, it's the fact that hand traps are both a blessing as well as a curse. They're a blessing because they actually allowed us in Spiral format to play beyond turn 1 and actually give the player going second an opportunity to go off, assuming the Spiral player didn't brick, but more often than not, that wasn't necessarily the case. But hand traps are also a curse because when people are having to main deck 13 to 14 hand traps just to stop one deck from being able to go off and do its plays, is that necessarily healthy for the game itself? And this is a topic I wanted to explore and kind of go into a little bit more in depth in regards to hand traps themselves and kind of how they show us where the state of the game currently is. Now, I wanted to start this discussion off by comparing them to regular trap cards, because regular trap cards have been the original form of disruption since this game's inception. You know, initially spell cards were used during your turn and trap cards were used typically as a way to interrupt your opponent's plays during their turn, and that's pretty much how the game has always been. But then hand traps entered the fray and things kind of shifted up. Now, one just comparison I want to quickly make here is just as an example. So let's say you're going up against a Paleozoic player and their opening move is they set 5 cards and pass turn to you. The interesting thing to note here is that you have a maximum of 5 trap cards, possibly 5 trap cards, that you have to deal with, but there is a defined maximum. And while the minimum is undefined, because I mean, frankly, they could just set all spell cards, but realistically, I don't think that's going to happen. There is the possibility that among those 5 back row, some of them may just be bluffs and they're trying to bluff you out or maybe play around certain cards. But the thing is, as the opposing player, you know that once all of those cards are removed from the opponent's field, since they have no cards in hand, then you know that you're free to play and go on with your plays once all of those cards are removed from the field. Now, take player B, for instance, here, who just draws their opening 5 cards and passes turn. It's a little bit different than if they set 5 cards in their back row, because yes, while you know that they don't necessarily have any trap cards on the field, hand traps are a little bit different because of the fact that it's an undefined arbitrary number of how many hand traps they have in their hand that's only limited to the number of cards currently available in their hand. You know, with back row, if your opponent has 2 back row, they just have 2 back row and you know that set number. Whereas with hand traps, they could have 1 hand trap, they could have 2 hand traps, they could have 3, 4, even 5 hand traps. Hell, they could have no hand traps. You have no idea because it's limited to the number of cards in the player's hand when it comes to hand traps. And that gives the player using hand traps a bit of an advantage because psychologically, as long as they keep 1 card in their hand, it could not be anything of value, but to your opponent, they may think that that 1 card is a hand trap. It's an additional card that they're going to have to play around as they proceed with their play. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't the only game to have hand trap-like cards. Magic the Gathering has something very similar in the form of instants where they can be used to interrupt your opponent's plays. The difference is, though, with Magic the Gathering is that their cards require an additional resource to be able to be activated. In this case, it's mana. So if your opponent does have hand traps, the amount of hand traps they're able to play during your opponent's turn or even during their own turn is actually limited to the amount of mana that they have available and the amount of resource management they've taken into consideration when it comes to doing those specific plays. But since Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have any other form of resource management other than card advantage for the most part, then that actually makes a really big difference, because in Magic, if your opponent runs out of mana, you know that they don't have anything else and you're free to just do as much as you want because they don't have the resources to use any more of their instants to interrupt you. Where with Yu-Gi-Oh! You're pretty much defined by what cards you have and how many actions you can take in a single turn. You don't have that other resource pretty much preventing you from being able to go off or as hard as you want. Now this moves on to my second point when it comes to hand traps, and the fact that you can destroy back row. You can banish back row, you can bounce back row back to the hand, to the top of the deck, you can shuffle it back into the deck, you can do a wide variety of things to your opponent's back row. you really can't do a whole lot when it comes to their hand traps. Now, I know some people are going to say, oh, well, there's cards like Mind Drain, or there's, you know, someone's going to say Light Force Sword just to like troll, but realistically, what options are there to deal with hand traps? Well, the best options I could come up with realistically are Solemn Strike and Psyframe Gear Gamma. Now, the thing about both of those is that Solemn Strike is a trap, and Psyframe Gear Gamma, while it is a hand trap, requires you to have no monsters on the field and also play another engine requirement brick card in your deck in order for Gamma to be used. Now, the thing that both of those cards share in common is that they're both reactive options. If you're going against an opponent and they set 2 back row, there is a card like Twin Twister that you could have in your hand, and you can proactively activate the Twin Twister to blow away your opponent's back row before you proceed forward with your play. However, there isn't a card to proactively allow you to play through hand traps. The closest example of this would be is if cards like Confiscation or the Forceful Sentry came off the ban list, allowed you to look at your opponent's hand, remove the hand trap that's going to possibly, you know, be an issue for you from their hand, and then you can proceed with their play knowing that they don't have any hand traps, or knowing how many and which other hand traps you need to play around for the duration of your turn. But there is a reason that Confiscation and Forceful Sentry are both on the ban list, and that's because having that sort of knowledge of your opponent's hand is just a crazy advantage, especially when it comes to the game of Yu-Gi-Oh!, and that's why both of those cards are banned. However, there is just instances where you sometimes can't play around a hand trap, and it actually just flat out loses you the game. I mean, sometimes you're going to draw hands where you only have one viable line of play, and if your opponent has that one specific hand trap that they can use to disrupt that play, then you're just shit out of luck, and it basically comes down to where mentally you're deciding, well, I need to make the highest risk play possible, and if they have the hand trap, they have it, and then I'm just fucked. Or if they don't, then I'm going to be in a somewhat advantageous position, and then I also know that they don't have that hand trap. But it kind of goes back to, again, is that really healthy for the game? Now, we've seen how hand traps had a prolific effect on the game when it comes to a card like Evenly Matched. Evenly Matched is a trap card that can be used like a hand trap. And let me pose the question to you. If Evenly Matched did not have the clause where you could activate it from the hand if you control no cards, would it be nearly as powerful as it currently is today? And the answer to that question is absolutely not, because then you would have to set it face down, basically waste a whole turn, meaning that if you're playing into your opponent's board, your opponent's more than likely going to have a form of disruption to pop the Evenly Matched before you can get any sort of value off of it whatsoever, and the card's going to be absolutely fucking worthless to you. So even trap cards are essentially taking on the form of hand traps for them to even be viable when it comes to modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, I think one thing that we haven't discussed in this video is really the ultimate issue that all of these cards stem from. Now, hand traps are ultimately the result of power creep, and if you don't open hand traps turn 1, you're basically fucked, and that's essentially how the game has evolved to, especially when we get into these tier 0 formats that have been very short-lived but have had a very significant effect on this game's history as a whole, because it really isn't fun that if you don't open a hand trap, you literally just flat out lose the game, because decks are building such unbreakable and unwinnable boards with anywhere from like 4 to 6 forms of disruption that it doesn't matter what you have, you realistically have no way of winning that game unless you open the perfect series of like one-ofs in order to clear that board. And that, again, that doesn't make for a very healthy game. Now, the interesting thing about hand traps is, you know, going from Spiral format back to something like Zodiac format, and I'm specifically talking about after Fusion Sub combo was removed from the game, Zodiac format was interesting because hand traps actually had a very interesting role in Zodiac format, because you could actually play through hand traps. I mean, cards like Ghost Ogre and Ash Blossom, some people even played Ghost Reaper, but no one was playing Droll and Lockbird after Fusion Sub combo was removed from the game. But the thing is, with Zodiac format, you would actually be able to play through these hand traps and have an interactive game, but that's for a couple different reasons. First off, Zodiac, while Zodiac Trident was one of the most oppressive monsters ever created in this game's history, it wasn't an unbreakable board. If your opponent went first, most likely they were just going to end on a Trident in the instance of a pure Zodiac build, as well as some back row, but for all purposes, just the Trident itself was the biggest threat that they ultimately tried to achieve on turn 1. Now, the thing is, the way the decks were built and the way the decks functioned, because the deck had multiple extenders and all these different aspects, let's say you use Zodiac Barrage, your opponent could just Ghost Ogre that, and then you would do something else and your opponent would Ash Blossom it, then you could Shuffle Reborn, bring back a monster, and there was actually back and forth. And yeah, sure, Zodiac format might have had its problems as well, but in comparison to something like Spiral format, at least there was back and forth, and the game wasn't solely determined on turn 1. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from this video, is that hand traps can be healthy depending on the format in which they're played in, but it really depends on the decks that are currently being played in the competitive meta and whether or not those decks themselves are healthy for the game as a whole. I definitely think it's a really bad sign when people have to main deck 13 to 14 hand traps just so they can play the game going second, and that doesn't really facilitate any good gameplay or interactivity for one, but it also isn't fun, and this is a game that's supposed to be fun. So I think that ultimately, hand traps can be very beneficial for the game. They can be interactive and they can actually have their place. And again, they may not always take over the role of traps, even though as the game has evolved to the pace that it has, they've pretty much taken over that space. But we saw back in Zodiac format, a lot of players in Zodiac format were also playing trap cards in tandem with hand traps because the roles that each of those cards played individually helped make the deck the strong deck that it was. But guys, those are just my thoughts about the subject. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about hand traps as a whole and how you think they affect the overall health of the game, or if you think it really does stem from the viability of the competitive decks themselves, and really if they allow for fair and interactive gameplay. I'd really love to hear your thoughts and get a good discussion going. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you really found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.